by Jason Jimenez for sale for only $5 that a lot of the topics we'll be covering in the semester come out of that book, so if you want to buy that, that could be very useful. Also, if you want to be a member, just let one of the officers know. That would be me, Matt, and Will, who are back there. And also, the last thing you need to know is that we'll be having an election for our officers later this spring. We'll have potentially up to 4 places available to run for. So if you're a member and you'll want to run for office, let us know. And without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker for tonight, Benjamin Blowers.
This is the biggest room I've ever spoken in. It feels really weird to be this far away from you guys. So hopefully you'll bear with me as I'm like off in this dark corner over here talking to myself. Can you guys hear me okay? Is the audio coming through all right? Okay, cool. Yeah, along the lines of the officers that will be seeking to elect again for leading the student group here on campus, Wesley and I are working out some final details as to the roles and responsibilities, kind of articulating those and outlining those for your benefit. So if you're interested in running for one of those positions, you'll have kind of an idea of what you'll be doing throughout the year. And then in addition to that, I'm working on putting the finishing touches on an additional leadership training program that will be available to officers, to you as officers, doing everything from potentially some additional apologetics training, more intentional one-on-one discipleship, or in a small group setting, some leadership training if that's what you're interested in, some personal development coaching as well. We'll hopefully be offering a couple resources to those of you who do serve as officers, just to encourage you and make this not simply something that you do while you're in college, but something that actually invests back into you. For you being willing to serve as an officer. So again, if that's something you're interested in, talk to any one of our current officers, Matt and Will in the back, or Zach who is just up here, or you can talk to any of us staff as well. We'd love to have that conversation. Well, tonight we get to learn one of my favorite disciplines to study, which is logic. And hopefully you guys are going to learn the skills tonight that will lay the foundation for you to become more effective communicators and, like we talked last week, more effective or better conversational advocates for those conversations that you're going to have. Now, originally we'd put this talk kind of mid-semester, but as Wesley and I started thinking about this and how we wanted to proceed in the information, we realized that really logic is that foundational step where if you don't have it, not only can you not communicate effectively, but you can't actually think well. So if you don't have a foundation for how to think reasonably, how to proceed through an argument, how to evaluate true and false statements, it becomes impossible to actually think well and therefore communicate well. So that's what we're going to look into this evening. Now, what is logic? And we covered this a little bit last week, so this is just a real brief overview. Logic, the word itself, comes from the Greek logos, which refers to the reason or the mind. And it has to do with the principles of correct reasoning, right? It's the science of thinking well, or the discipline of ordered thought, right? So this is what actually lays the foundation, as I mentioned, for how to think well. But if you think about this, right, I'm saying that we can't even think well, but as I was kind of running through this scenario in my head, I realized that even an illogical person, someone we would identify as not using or not abiding by the rules of logic, is still bound themselves by logic, right? Without logic, it's impossible to think well. So the illogical person, someone who isn't thinking well themselves, are still bound by, as we're going to see here very shortly, the formal laws of logic, which Aristotle put forward. They're still bound by the law of identity, non contradiction, and excluded middle. So logic is an inescapable truth. My logic professor in grad school said that he actually had a professor who came to, or a student who came to him and said, Professor Samples, I don't think logic is as important as what you're saying it is. And so the professor kind of stepped back and said, can you give me a few reasons why you don't think logic is important? Right? I hope you can understand, as soon as that question is asked, that student would be then participating in logical reasoning to argue that logical reasoning wasn't necessary, right? So logic is essential to good thought. Kenneth Samples, this is my professor here, he said, logic is concerned with the fundamental subject of thinking and reasoning. It is the discipline of ordered thought. Now, Professor Samples is a author of numerous books, without a doubt, God Among Sages, 7 Truths That Changed the World, and then A World of Difference, which I have here. If you're interested in going into logical or rational thought in a very accessible way, but a very extensive study, I would highly recommend this book to you. You can take a look after we get done this evening. Now, all of us should be familiar with and eager to use logic in every aspect of life, whether religious or not, academically inclined or not, regardless of age, status, education, or any other marker that differentiates us from one another. We should all be familiar with and encouraged and eager to use logical skills. But as Christians, I would recognize that God has blessed us with the gift of the mind, the ability to think and reason well. And then we can use this gift, and we should use this gift, to love God by seeking to know and discover the truth. Samples said again that we should value and cultivate the life of the mind, and as believers, we should pursue the life of the mind to the glory of God. God has given us the gift of reason and the senses, so we can honor Him by stewarding them and using them for His glory and the pursuit of truth. And as we noted last week, Jesus actually referred to Himself as the truth. So if we're using the gift that God has given us of our reasonable mind, we can use that to then honor God and glorify Him by pursuing truth, which is pursuing Christ, something that we are all called to do as Christians. So, 3 laws of logic. This is kind of the framework that controls any conversation, whether we actually have ever encountered these formally or not. Now, Aristotle was the first one to formalize or systematize these laws, but he certainly wasn't the first one to utilize them, even unaware. He's known as the father of Western logic for this reason. And he believed that logic is a tool to help you arrive at truth. Now you can see we've got 3 laws here. We've got the law of non contradiction, the law of excluded middle, and the law of identity. And we'll go through in just a moment what each of those are. But I'll actually be providing you with both a metaphysical and an epistemological formulation of all 3 of those laws, right? And you can see up here on the screen, the metaphysical, how many of you are familiar with that term or would be like, I know what that means? Wow, I'm actually super impressed. I've still had to, until very recently, I had a document on my desktop where I had epistemological, ontological, and metaphysical. I had all 3 of those words and the definitions. So anytime I heard those come up in a class or in a conversation, I could just pull up the definitions and try to understand what the person was talking about. So I'm impressed and I'm very pleased that you're all familiar with that. But for those of you who may not be familiar, metaphysics is essentially the study of what a thing is, or what kind of or type of thing something is, right? So ontology would be different in a nuanced way. Ontology would be the study of what exists, right? What is, what actually exists. Metaphysics then comes in and says, okay, what is this existing or non-existing thing? What type of a thing is it? Is it something physical? Is it something abstract, and so on? Epistemology, on the other hand, is the study of how we know things. So when we're applying this to the 3 laws of logic, we'll be looking at the laws in a metaphysical cast, so what a thing is or is not, or what type of thing something is. And then we'll be looking at the epistemological cast, what can be true or false. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at here with each of these laws. And I hope that none of this is too overwhelming, or you're sitting here going, I don't even know half of the words. I'm hoping to be able to bring this down to a level that you'll be able to understand and implement, and it will help your thinking in the days and weeks ahead. Now, the law of non-contradiction. You can see here we've got a couple signs which I found humorous. I'm not sure if these were planted or if these are, we don't know the roads that surround them, but you've got something, do not enter and enter only, right? If you're in a car, what do? You're stuck, or stop, or no stopping at any time. You're stuck at that point because those signs contradict each other. Now, the law of non-contradiction, as applied to the field of logic, says that A cannot equal A and not A at the same time and in the same way, right? And an example of a statement like that would be this: Jesus Christ is God incarnate, and Jesus Christ is not God incarnate. Now, those two statements cannot equal each other. Do you catch that? The statement Jesus Christ is God incarnate and the statement Jesus Christ is not God incarnate cannot be equal at the same time and in the same way. The epistemological formulation of this law of non-contradiction would be this: the statement, it is raining. That statement cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same way. Now, one of you might say, well, Ben, somebody here could say it is not raining, and somebody in the rainforest of the Amazon could say it is raining. That doesn't violate the law. Well, that's why those second two phrases are important: at the same time and in the same way. Now, somebody could say that statement, it is raining, at two different places, and one be true and one be false, but they wouldn't be in the same respect. They would be referencing a different place, right? Does this make sense? I want to be able to break this down so it's accessible, because even as I was making some of my notes, I talked to Janae this afternoon, and I said, okay, I need you to proofread this and make sure all my logic is correct in my notes. So if you guys catch me making an error in something I say, go ahead and shoot your hand up and let me know, because we're wanting to think well. But a statement cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same way. Again, this is something that is fairly intuitive to us in our daily lives. So this is the first law of logic. The second law of logic is the law of excluded middle. So again, we have the metaphysical formulation, which is either A or not A, or the epistemological, a statement, talking about a statement here, a statement is either true or false. Again, a couple examples that I think hopefully help this a little more easy to understand. In the metaphysical sense, either Jesus' tomb was empty or Jesus' tomb was not empty. This law is saying you can't have both. You have to have one of those things being true and one of them being false. It can't be both. The statement that we could look at would be something like this: Jesus rose physically from the dead, or Jesus did not rise physically from the dead. Again, either the first statement, Jesus rose physically from the dead, can be true, or the second statement, Jesus did not physically rise from the dead, can be true. Only one of those can be true, or you could think about it this way: exactly one of those statements is true, and one of those statements is false. Okay? And then finally, you have the law of identity. And this one is kind of fun because it's so confusing and it's simultaneously so simple, right? Metaphysical, A is A. And the example that I came up with is Ben, myself. Ben is Ben. It simply means that a thing is what it is, okay? Because if things aren't what they are, then there's no way for us to even come in contact with reality, right? We know, I can't actually know, am I standing here in front of a podium talking to you, or am I, in a car driving off of a cliff somewhere, right? If things aren't what they are, then we can't know anything and can't function. But we know through our observation of reality that that's not the case. So things are what they are. Ben is Ben. An epistemological formulation would be this: a true statement is true, or a false statement is false. And here's an example: ice melts at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, right? We've been seeing a whole bunch of that melting happening outside here for the last couple days. So at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, this statement is true, that ice melts at that degrees. And the false statement that I came up with: storks bring babies. Right? Storks bring babies. That statement is false, and it is the case that statement is false. Right? A very simple concept, the law of identity, but one, as you start to kind of talk about it, it can start to sound confusing. But it's important as we work through different ways of logical reasoning, logical thought, these three laws will always be applicable. They will always be enforced in every statement we make. Everyone tracking with me? I think hopefully I'm not going too fast here. Now, here are just a couple basics. Again, I don't know, I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with this, all of these concepts, but if you're not, we'll go through them quickly. Now, what do we mean by an argument? We talked last week, an argument is not something, a verbal fisticuffs or getting angry. My professor liked to say, not having your jugular vein popping out, right? An argument is simply a supported claim or opinion. And what is the support? That's referred to as the premise. The conclusion is the thing that is being supported, the statement that is being supported. You might ask, well, what's a statement? It's a sentence that is either true or false, and that truth or falsity is referred to as the truth value. And then finally, we have this inferential relationship between the premises and the conclusion. That's what ties the premises to the conclusion, allows them to support. This is just basic stuff. Hopefully it's review for all of you. But I think it's important to, again, lay this groundwork as we're striving to think well. Now, Hurley, the author of the A Concise Introduction to Logic, said this: an argument, in its simplest form, is a group of statements, one or more of which, the premises, are claimed to provide support for or reasons to believe one of the other statements, which is the conclusion. Now, if you have a collection of statements, when there is no evidence given, there is no argument, right? If I said the Huskers are the best team in the world, that's not an argument. That's simply a statement. That's an assertion. If there's no conclusion, on the other hand, there's no argument because we simply have a list of facts or information, right? I could say we're in the ballroom. There are tables set up in the ballroom. I am speaking in the ballroom. You are sitting in the ballroom. And we are currently residing in Lincoln, Nebraska. Have I made an argument? No. Okay? Because there's no conclusion. There was nothing that all of those things were supporting. Now, we could potentially create or come to a conclusion that those premises would support or that information would support, but we won't have an argument without a conclusion, right? But the tighter the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, the more easily you can arrive at the conclusion. Now, for the conclusion to be adequately supported, though, the premises must be true, they must be true, and the argument must employ correct reasoning, and we're going to look at a numerous different ways that can go wrong. Okay, again from Professor Samples. He gave us a helpful trick, and if you're taking notes, I would recommend you write this down. He gave us a helpful principle, or a number of helpful principles for evaluating the premises, right? If we're attempting to make an argument, as I'm doing here tonight, I'm making an argument for what thinking well entails, right? For what logic is. Here's a way that you can start to evaluate the premises that you are giving or that someone else is giving. And you can remember this with the acronym TRACK, T-R-A-C-K. The first word in the acronym is true. Are the premises true? If the premises are true, you can proceed. If the premises are false, right, then you don't really have to engage. I mean, you can engage with the argument, but those aren't going to be good premises in support of a conclusion. So true, premises need to be true. Secondly, they need to be relevant. Premises need to be relevant. Now, we're going to look at some examples later where premises may be true, but are irrelevant to the argument being made. Thirdly, premises need to be adequate. And what I mean by adequate is simply this, that the premises are sufficient in number, kind, and weight. Okay? Sufficient in number, kind, and weight. And I have had some conversations where another has argued that the premises that I've offered aren't sufficient in number. There aren't enough of them, or they're not impactful enough. They don't carry enough intellectual weight to cause serious consideration. That's a fair claim to be made against any types of premises, but again, that's an argument that needs to be supported. So, Principles or the premises need to be true, relevant, adequate, and clear. If we have a whole bunch of information, premises or support that is oriented toward a particular statement or a conclusion, right, they need to be clear, they need to be concise, and therefore understandable, or thereby understandable. And finally, premises need to be knowledgeable. They need to contain information. Okay? So with these 5 principles, premises can be evaluated, and you can begin to examine your own arguments that you're making and the arguments of others to see where the flaws may be, where you can shore up your own thinking, and how you can become a better communicator. So, now moving on from some of this basic groundwork that we're looking at, let's move into the 3 types of arguments. How many of you have seen this movie, The Three Musketeers? No one? I would recommend it. Janae and I just happened to watch it the other night. Pretty enjoyable ride. It was very action heavy, a lot of shoot 'em up and sword play. It was an enjoyable movie. So this isn't going to go over super well with this audience, but the Three Musketeers are a group of guys who live back in France and kind of fall in hard times, and that's where their story goes. But they had they were kind of assassins or militiamen for hire, I guess. You've got the 3 guys here. Athos, he was kind of a ninja. He was the brains of the operation, very stealthy and smart. Porthos, he was the muscle, utilizing brute strength. He just kind of liked to fight his way into something or fight his way out of something. And then you have Aramis, who was a former priest, which was an interesting little side story. But he was, I like to think of him as being as lethal with the sword as he was or had been religious prior to becoming an assassin for hire. Right? But these 3 guys work together, and so you've got these 3 logical arguments that also work together to move us toward, or hopefully move us toward, truth and a better understanding of the world. First, and this, again, is probably one of the more familiar logical argument forms that you would have come into contact with. This is the deductive argument. Now, deductive arguments, we're going to get into it at some depth, but in short, deductive arguments move towards certainty of conclusion. They introduce no new information in the conclusion, and in general, or I think always, deductive arguments move from general to particular in the argument form. They move from the cause of something to the effect of something. That's the structure that they're going to follow. Inductive arguments don't move us towards certainty of the conclusion or the certainty of truth of the conclusion, but they move it to the probability of the conclusion. But they can, inductive arguments can introduce new information into the conclusion, as we'll see later on. And they do the opposite that deduction does. It moves from the particular to the general, or from the effect to the cause, right? You work backwards from the effect of something to the cause. And then finally, abductive arguments, they lack certainty, so they're unlike deduction. They do move toward probability, but so they're somewhat like induction, but it's not predictive. You're not trying to figure out what might happen this next time. So it's unlike induction in that way. So let's move through what a deductive argument is, and here really is the meat. And I promise there will be some time for interaction here real shortly. I think this will be a good time here. So a deductive argument, like I said, attempts to provide the certainly true conclusions. And it's generally, because it is so restrictive, because it is so tight in its reasoning, it's very difficult to apply outside of the realms of formal logic and mathematics, or geometry, which employ actual logical reasoning. Here's an example of one form of logical reasoning, of deduction, which uses the syllogism, which syllogism is just a particular form of argumentation or a particular form of argument that utilizes 2 premises and a conclusion. As you can see here, premise 1, all Avengers live in the Marvel universe. Iron Man is an Avenger. Therefore, Iron Man lives in the Marvel universe. All right, so you have 2 premises moving from the general, all Avengers, to the specific, or the particular Iron Man, and therefore you can come to a certainly true conclusion if both of these premises are true, okay? If both of the premises are true, a deductive argument will give you a certainly true conclusion. It's very tight. The reasoning is very tight there. But there are a few places where deduction can go wrong. And real basically, I think this is where, in some of my conversations with some of you, this is where some of the confusion comes to bear, right? So deduction can go wrong in a number of different places. What we're looking for here, I'm going to jump to the third one down here, right? A sound argument. That's what we want when we're making a deductive argument. We want solid reasoning and true premises. If we don't have, if we have solid reasoning, then we have a valid argument. If we have bad reasoning, where the premises don't support the conclusion, then, or where the form of the argument is wrong, then we have an invalid argument. But as you can see, if we have solid reasoning, then we move to evaluate the premises. Are the premises true or are they false? What is their truth value? If the premises are true, we have a sound argument, which is what we want. If the premises are false, that's where the unsound, this terminology of unsound argument comes from. And indeed, an invalid argument would also be unsound, but I felt it helpful to maybe break that out a little bit so you can see the differences. So solid reasoning means you at least have a valid argument. That doesn't mean it's correct or it's true or the conclusion is true, but it means the reasoning is good. Bad reasoning, invalid. True premises, along with solid reasoning, sound arguments, and solid reasoning with false premises, you have an unsound argument. So here's where the fun begins. Here are four different arguments. I want you guys, let's pair up in twos. So we'll do the two of you. Yeah, I think that'll work. Maybe let's do the front four here. Adam, I'm going to leave you out this time. Let's pair up in twos, and I want you to go through real quickly and evaluate these arguments. See if you can identify where they go wrong or where they go right. I'll give you just 90 seconds or so to do that, and then we'll have some back and forth and we'll talk about it. Some areas where maybe the reasoning didn't work out, or maybe what types of errors are being made in some of these arguments. Go ahead, and how about the first one? So the grass is green, sky is blue, therefore the earth is round. Is this valid, invalid, sound, or unsound? Say it a little louder. Valid. Why? Yes, correct. The premises are true, but the reasoning is incorrect, so we have an invalid argument. True premises and conclusion, though, right? A lot of times when we think about something being valid, we're like, oh yeah, that's good, right? Well, not always. We have to do some more work when we're looking at deductive reasoning. So correct, we have an invalid argument, but we have true premises and a true conclusion. But is this a good argument or one that we would want to employ if we're talking about, if we're talking to someone with a flat earth perspective? No. I hope you guys will be a little more emphatic, like, I don't know, this one might be convincing, right? No, this would be a terrible argument, even though there is truth in all of those premises. I guess as long as you're watering your grass in the summer. All right, how about the second one? All Avengers live in the Marvel Universe. Iron Man is an Avenger, therefore Iron Man lives in the Marvel Universe. And if you were paying attention to the previous slide, you got a slight peek at what this is. Pardon? It is. It's a sound argument. Why? You're correct. The argument you made for why it is a sound argument is also true. It is true that these are true premises, and the reasoning is correct. Okay? How about the next one? All humans have pink polka dot skin. Ben is a human. Last check. Therefore, Ben has pink polka dot skin. What's wrong with this one? Unsound. Why? Okay. Okay. Is this valid? What's that? Is this a valid argument? I'm seeing some hesitancy. Okay, there's a little more comments. Yeah, it's a valid argument, right? If it's true, so this is a way you can identify a valid argument. Just assume all the premises are true, right? Throw your lie detector out the window for a second. Assume all the premises are true, and then say, does this work? Well, if it's true that all humans have pink polka dot skin, and I'm a human, then it follows logically that I would have pink polka dot skin as well. Unfortunately, though, we have a false premise, okay? And then how about the last one? All students at UNL graduate with honors. Ben was a student at UNL. Therefore, Ben did not graduate with honors. What's wrong with this one? Everything. You're saying that it's false? What's wrong with it? Call it out. Okay, so the conclusion doesn't follow. That's correct. Is it true that all students at UNL graduate with honors? I mean, it's possible. Everyone's sitting here, right? You guys still have that ahead of you. But no, that would be a false statement because I didn't actually graduate with honors here. So I falsify that statement. It's true, though, that I was a student here at UNL. But then the reasoning is really bad, right? It should, correctly formulated, or if this was a valid argument, it would say that Ben then did graduate with honors, but it says I didn't. So the reasoning breaks down there, right? Is this helpful? Does this help kind of break down the differences? Now, there is overlap between valid or invalid arguments and unsound arguments. Oftentimes, we're dealing with invalid arguments or one that breaks down in forms. It's not very often that you get one is obviously false as this fourth argument here. Now, deductive arguments have three forms, okay, and pay attention because there will be another matching here in just a little bit. Deductive arguments take three forms, and this is Latin. Modus ponens, meaning affirming the antecedent, right? So this is the structure that this type of deductive argument takes. If P, then Q, P, or when I was tutoring somebody in logic, I said, we have P, therefore, we have Q. That's the form of the argument. If we have P, if we'll make P this cup, Chick-fil-A is not a sponsor of this event. If we have this cup, then I am holding something. I have this cup, therefore I am holding something, right? That's how that structure would look. So if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, and that follows with logical certainty there in the conclusion. The second one, modus tollens, means denying the consequent, and you can see the structure here. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Okay? If P, then Q, so it starts out the same, but then we deny the consequent, the Q here, whatever that might be. Therefore, we can logically deduce that we do not have P. And then finally, and these are both hypothetical syllogisms or if-then statements. If-then statements. And finally, we have what's called a disjunctive syllogism, which is denying the disjunct. So this is an either-or statement. Either we have P, or either P or Q, not Q, and the logical conclusion is therefore P. Okay? So, you have those structures in mind. Here we're going to have you again pair up, and this time let's have you pair, well, I don't care. Go ahead and pair across the aisle so we mix it up a little bit so you guys get to talk to someone else. So, which ones do we have? Modus ponens, modus tollens, and a disjunctive syllogism. And if you can't remember, that's okay. So we've got modus tollens, modus ponens, and then the disjunctive syllogism. We're able to identify which ones each one was. Let's take this first one here. If it is Easter, then it is Sunday. It is not Sunday, therefore it is not Easter. What form of deductive argument is this? Sure, Wesley. That's correct. Why? Yes, that's correct. Yep, modus tollens, remember, denying the consequent. So we have a negation. That's what that not is in formal logic. It's referred to as a negation. So we have a negation there in the second premise, and that's a good indicator for a deductive argument that you're dealing with a modus tollens argument. Now, no one's going to care or really understand what you're saying if you're like, well, I'm going to make a modus ponens argument here, right? But this is just kind of helping you understand the form so that you can begin to identify where the flaws in the reasoning might be if you're in conversation, or as you're trying to strive toward better thinking yourself. That's why we're going over this. How about the second one? Either Jesus is God incarnate, or Jesus was simply a man. Jesus was not simply a man, therefore Jesus is God incarnate. What type of argument on this one? John? Disjunctive? You would be correct, right? This is a disjunctive syllogism. Why? Correct. Yep, it logically follows that if there are only two possibilities, either it's this one or it's this one, and we know it's not this one over here, logically it has to be this one. This is why deductive arguments are so desirable and so hard to come by, because very often in everyday life it's very difficult to come up with those stark either-or statements. There's actually a fallacy. I don't know if we'll be able to cover it, but there's actually an either-or fallacy where you set up a false dichotomy, right? And you force someone into two opposing positions when actually there might be a third position, or those you don't have to decide between those two positions. But in deductive logic, this actually is a very good way of reasoning, because it helps you identify a conclusion with certainty. And then finally, this last one. If Tony Stark is Iron Man, then Tony Stark is an Avenger. Tony Stark is Iron Man, therefore Tony Stark is an Avenger. If you can't tell, I enjoy Marvel, right? What form of argument is this one? Yeah. Correct. Yep. This is a modus ponens argument, right? Affirming the antecedent. So those are the three forms of, or three of the most common forms of deductive reasoning. Now there are some others, and there's a whole, I didn't have time to create a slide with all of the symbolic logic, and you start getting into some incredible proofs that are very complex. Generally, this is all you need. If you're familiar with this stuff, you'll be able to reason well and reason through arguments and assertions and premises and conclusions that others are offering. So that's deductive logic in a nutshell. Let's move on to inductive arguments. Inductive arguments, remember, introduce no new information, or they can introduce new information in the conclusion, but these move from the particular to the general, they move from the effect to the cause, right? And this is probably one of the most frequent forms of logical reasoning that we use on a daily basis, right? We also use a lot of abductive reasoning as well, which we'll get into next. But think about this, when you cross the street here, when you were coming into the Union, right? You looked both ways, hopefully, and you crossed the street with a good confidence, or a high probability, high degree of confidence that you weren't going to get hit by a car or struck by a meteorite. Why? Well, you were reasoning from the particular. Here's my particular situation of walking across the street, and you were reasoning, you were reasoning from the particular instance of all the other times that you've crossed the street to the general of walking across the street in general, and having confidence with a high degree of probability that it's true that you're not going to get hit by a car or struck by a meteorite, right? So here's the example that we can think through for inductive reasoning. This is more of a formal way to look at it. This I borrowed from Ken Sample's book here, A World of Difference. Adolf Hitler was a dictator and an evil man. Joseph Stalin was a dictator and an evil man. Mao Zedong was a dictator and evil man. The Shah of Iran, Ayub Khan, Saddam Hussein, Idi Amin, Kim Jong-il, and Hussein Mubarak were all dictators and evil men. Therefore, there's a good conclusion indicator word. Therefore, it is highly likely or highly probable that the next dictator to appear on the world scene will also be an evil man. Do you see what we did there? We had a number of particular instances in which we saw the same thing happen, and then we moved to the general, the next person. We don't know who this is, but given that all of these other dictators, and we could have a whole much longer list, all of these other dictators were evil men, so it's probable, and we would say that this is a strong argument, and even a cogent argument, as we'll see in a moment, that the next dictator will be an evil man. Now, do we have logical certainty? No, I'm saying a few no's. You're correct, right? There could be a dictator who's a benevolent dictator, right? Who uses his absolute authority to throw the gold of the country's treasury out the plane window and bless the people, right? Probably not very likely that it's going to happen, but it's possible, right? So we don't have certainty like we were seeing in deductive argumentation, but we have a very strong or a cogent argument here that we can rely on and with a high degree of reasonability, I guess you could say. Now, with deductive reasoning, you have valid and invalid, sound and unsound arguments, right? And of course, we want the sound arguments. With inductive arguments, we have strong and weak, and cogent and uncogent arguments. And here's the same kind of framework that you can identify them. If the conclusion probably follows from the premises, then you have a strong argument, and if it doesn't probably follow, then it's a weak argument. If the conclusion probably follows and you have a true premise, it's a cogent argument, and if it has false premises, it's an uncogent argument. Now notice for none of these, either deduction or induction, right, we're not talking in terms of true or false arguments. Truth and falsity can only apply to statements, right? Truth and falsity can only apply to statements. Now, you can have true or false conclusions, but as an argument, we don't speak in terms of true and false arguments because that's unclear. What would you mean by a true argument, right, or a false argument? It would be essentially impossible to identify where that argument had gone wrong. But when you say you have a weak argument, that means in induction that you have an unstable link, or there's a very weak link between the premises, the support, and the statement that you're trying to support, or the conclusion, right? Here's maybe the best way to think about this, and this is also from Hurley's Concise Introduction to Logic, right? I don't know if you guys can see this super well. The coloring's a little bit off here. But you can see if you go down the strong, this first, the second column right here, you go down to the third one, every U.S. president was a TV debater. Therefore, probably the next U.S. president will be a TV debater, right? Again, here's the way you can identify where the flaw in the argument might be, or if it's a good argument, strong or weak. You say, okay, I'm going to assume everything is true. Now, you can see from the column that it's a strong argument, but you can also see from the argument itself. If it's true that every previous U.S. president was a TV debater, then you have a strong argument that the next U.S. president will also be a TV debater. However, you have a false premise. So this would be an uncogent inductive argument, right? A cogent inductive argument would be there at the top in the middle column. Every previous U.S. president was older than 40. Therefore, probably the next U.S. president will be older than 40. So again, assuming the premises are true, you have a very strong argument, a good reason to believe the truth of the conclusion, right? But then you can also examine the premise. Is the premise true? And I'd have to appeal to probably Joel's memorization of the presidents, if that's true. But it is true that we've never had a president younger than 40 years old, and so we have a good or a cogent inductive argument here. Okay? So I won't spend time going through all of these because induction can be somewhat confusing because we use it often, we employ it often in everyday life, but we don't always speak in terms of cogency or a lack of cogency. Here's a way you can remember kind of how it breaks down, right? You've got an argument, which again is just a collection of statements, some of which are the support and others, and one of which is the conclusion. And each of those statements has a truth value. It's either true, or it is false. And then you have two types of arguments here, deductive and inductive. You can see up on the deduction side, you have the valid. And then finally, if you have true premises, you have the sound arguments. If you have false premises, unsound, and so on, right? This is a helpful chart that helped me kind of map out in my head where all of this terminology of argumentation goes, because it can start to sound like we're spinning our wheels a little bit. We're using the same words and getting nowhere. But it's helpful to have these categories in mind so that when you are writing a paper, when you are in conversation with somebody, and they are asking you, well, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you believe that the tomb was empty? If you said, well, the sun rose yesterday, and I heard the birds chirping, and man, that made me feel good, and that's why I believe Christ rose, or Christianity is true. Are all those things true? We could examine that, but that's not a good argument, right? That wouldn't be relevant premises to support the conclusion. No, we would want to move toward strong support or relevant information in support of what we believe, right? So let's look at the third type of reasoning here, abductive arguments. And I guess I'll admit this to you. I was in school a number of years ago here, and I started writing a paper, and I was like, well, what am I going to write this paper on? And I started writing, and as I got, I don't know, a page or two into this paper, I found myself, I was like, man, this abductive argument, this is kind of sketchy. And so I started thinking, I think I can make this into the main thrust of my paper, that abductive reasoning is not a good form of reasoning. Thankfully, though, I did a quick Google search and all of a sudden realized that it's one of the 3 strong forms of reasoning, and actually it's most suitable to what I do now as a Christian apologist. I would say this is one of the forms of argument that is most easily applied to the area of Christian apologetics. Why is that? It's because it moves from evidence to an explanation, right? It looks at reality as it is, whether it's present reality or past reality, history, and says, okay, what is the evidence that we are dealing with? What evidence exists? What's the best explanation for that, right? It's a very good form of reasoning, and it's used by investigators, doctors, mechanics, historians, anyone who's a diagnostician, right? Who's trying to diagnose something. They're going to look at the evidence, whether it's a person who's ill, right? Right now, we've got a whole bunch of diagnosticians. That's a hard word to say sometimes. We have a whole bunch of them right now looking at COVID symptoms, right? Whether there is the evidence that is at hand being presented in someone's physical body, right? Whether there's fever, cough, runny nose, and all the rest. Does the best explanation, or is the best explanation that this person has COVID, or that they have the flu, or cancer, or something else, right? This is a form of reasoning that we use frequently alongside inductive reasoning in our everyday lives, right? It moves from the evidence to the explanation. And again, just as a reminder, it lacks certainty, right? So when you're using inductive arguments or abductive arguments, we have to remember that we're not dealing with certainly true conclusions. We're dealing with probably true conclusions in induction, or we're moving, or we're working towards a likelihood or a good probability of truth, or a best explanation, right? And there are 5 ways that we can think about how to evaluate abductive arguments, because it can sound a little abstract at times, I'll admit. So here's what we want to look at. In the 5 aspects of abductive reasoning, the first aspect that we need to identify is are the premises and is the explanation coherent, right? So when we're looking at the premises, is the reasoning internally logically consistent? Because if we're employing, contradictions, if we have contradictory premises in an abductive argument, it's going to fail, right? It's going to be a poor argument. So is the internal reasoning logically consistent? That's the coherence test. Then you have the question, is this abductive reasoning, is the explanation that we have, is it factual? Is it consistent with the facts? Does it account for the facts? Right? Is it dealing with the evidence we have presented? Right? When a detective or an investigator walks into a homicide scene, they're not going to be pulling evidence from the room across the hall where nothing happened. No, they're going directly to the scene of the crime. They're pulling only the facts that are relevant to the case. So, and then you have to use reasoning that aligns with those facts, that utilizes those facts. The third aspect is balancing complexity and simplicity. And this one is kind of a difficult one in some ways to think through. I know some of you are familiar with Occam's razor. Have you heard that term, Occam's razor? Right? Named after a guy, William of Occam, lived in the 13th to 14th centuries. He was a philosopher and theologian. He wrestled with this concept of, well, how do we evaluate reasoning like this, or how do we evaluate explanations, right? When we have two competing explanations, how do we differentiate or figure out which one is better? That's kind of what he wrestled with. And in a very broad generalization of his principle that bears his name now, is that entities should not be multiplied without necessity. In other words, or stated plainly, the simplest explanation is generally preferable. The simplest explanation is generally preferable. Now, when we're applying this to abductive reasoning, we are moving for a simple explanation, right? We don't want to add unnecessary complexity, but the explanation that we're coming up with needs to be fully orbed or broad enough or all-encompassing enough to account for all of the facts, right? If we're developing an explanation for why all of us are here tonight and we don't account for certain facts, then that's not going to be as preferable an explanation as one that accounts for all of the facts. Does that make sense? So we have to balance simplicity, not adding too many steps or too much unnecessary reasoning in, but we also have to be complex enough, not overly simplistic. We have to be complex enough to account for all of the data. Fourthly, we need an explanation that accommodates possible counter evidence or additional evidence yet to be uncovered, right? An explanation that would fall apart upon the discovery of additional information is not one that's desirable, right? Let's say we're looking at the Kennedy assassination, right? And we're trying to establish the facts, the conclusion, or the best explanation for what happened to Kennedy. Now, we know he died. How did it happen would be the question that we're asking. If our explanation that we came up with was that actually there was a rock that was kicked up by the tires of one of the vehicles that ricocheted off of a building at a high velocity and hit Kennedy in the head, that would explain his death, right? That would explain the fact that he died, and might even explain the type of wound we would see if we were doing an autopsy or we were looking at the autopsy that happened. But upon another presentation of a fact, right, the fact that there was a bullet wound, right, from that there was what was referred to as the magic bullet. It actually passed through another individual and struck Kennedy. Maybe our explanation of this rock being kicked up wouldn't be able to account for that. Or what about the fact that Oswald's rifle was discovered by the FBI, right? Well, a rock getting kicked up can't even account for that evidence. It's too fragile. It would fall apart. So the best explanation, or the preferable explanation that we want to have, would be one that is malleable or flexible enough as to account for additional facts as they arise, right? It doesn't always mean that new facts will arise, but it needs to be not so fragile or rigid that it can't. And finally, the last aspect of abductive reasoning is asking the question, does it have explanatory power and scope? Now, by power, we simply mean, does it explain the facts? Does it have the power to explain the facts? And then scope has to deal with how much does it explain? Does it explain all of them? Kind of like we've been talking. So there's some overlap here, but all of these 5 principles help us evaluate explanations of the same evidence, right? So when we're looking at claims of Christianity, whether God exists or not, or whether the Bible has been faithfully translated or not, when we're evaluating those types of arguments and those types of explanations, we can bring these principles to bear. Are the explanations coherent? Like we looked a couple weeks ago at the fact of the empty tomb, right? What's the best explanation for the empty tomb? And can it account for all of the facts that we see historically? Also, this is where I think a lot of the alternative explanations for the empty tomb fall short, is that they don't account for everything, right? They don't account for possible counter evidence, or they don't have explanatory scope. They don't cover everything. So here's how we might use abductive reasoning within Christendom. The universe began to exist. That's the Kalam argument. Moral duties and values exist. That's the moral. The universe displays order and contains information. The tomb was empty. The Bible has been faithfully transmitted and translated. Evil exists and we are able to identify it. Therefore, this would be the abductive conclusion. Therefore, it is reasonable to believe that the God of the Christian Bible exists. Okay, that's not a logically certain conclusion, right? And that may sound disquieting to you just hearing that's not a logically certain, but given this form of argumentation, if this is all the information we're given, if each of those premises are true, I would argue that the best explanation is that God exists. Now, then we would have to do a lot of work to argue for the universe beginning to exist. And that's actually a form of deductive argument. The Kalam cosmological argument, right? Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. If the premises are true, the conclusion is logically certain, right? And so then we have to, now we've got to do the work to argue for the truthfulness of those premises, the accuracy of those premises. Once we've done that, then we can say we actually have a logically, I guess I misphrased that a little bit. It should be the universe has a cause, right? But if the universe has a cause, we actually have a logically certain argument up there if we've done our work beforehand. And you can start to work down that list as you start to build a case for the existence of God, and thereby the accuracy of the Christian belief system, right? If all of these premises are true, then we would arrive at the conclusion that an eternal, immaterial, non-spatial, immensely powerful creator, omnibenevolent, omniscient, purposeful, victorious, faithful, communicative, and holy God exists, right? I think that would be a pretty strong argument to say, you know what, the God of the Christian Bible is not only existing, but is the true God and one worthy of our worship, okay? Does that make sense? So that's abductive reasoning. It doesn't give us logically certain conclusions, but it gives us best explanation for the evidence that we have. So in review, we've got deductive arguments, which move toward certainty, or strive for certainty. Inductive, which is looking at probability. And abductive, who's distinctive as a type of reasoning, is the best explanation, right? Ed Miller said this. I really liked how he said this. The philosopher and others who reason critically can no more do without logic than the physicist can do without mathematics, right? This is a tool for those of us, and I think by each one of you being here, you desire to be a rational, reasonable, critical person. Not critical toward others, but critical of ideas, critical of thought and patterns and speaking. So, as we're looking at this semester, and we're wanting to become more effective evangelists, more effective ambassadors for Christ, and advocates not only for the other person that we're conversing with, but advocates for the truth, we ought to employ good reasoning. I hope that tonight has been helpful in equipping you to do so. So, if you guys have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Any questions? Anything from online? Okay. Yeah, Rachel. So the question, how does this, the tendency for some to move toward a relativistic view of truth impact this type of reasoning? Yeah, that's an insightful question. Well, so the idea of relativity, which we've covered some in past semesters, is this idea that truth isn't absolute in the sense that it applies to everyone. Truth is relative in that it applies individually, right? So I can have my truth. This is often how it's phrased these days. I can have my truth and you can have your truth, and we'll just coexist or be tolerant of each other, which more often, Wesley's shirt, contradict. Oftentimes you'll see a shirt that says, or a bumper sticker that says, coexist, and it has all the, a number of different religious symbols on there, right? Well, there's actually an internally inconsistent or logically contradictory statement there. But to get to your point, relativism is this idea that truth only applies individually. It doesn't have an overarching command of reality, right? And so when we're looking at logic, I guess I'll maybe approach the question this way. If you were having somebody who says, well, that's all well and good that you've studied logic and have given me a deductive argument or an inductive argument, I appreciate that, but that's your truth. I would encourage you to maybe ask them, can you explain to me why the laws of logic or this deductive argument doesn't apply to you, or how it doesn't apply to you? Because as soon as they do that, as soon as they attempt to explain why it doesn't apply to them, they're applying the laws of logic to themselves. And then hopefully in conversation you can graciously show them or indicate to them that they're employing logical reasoning just as you are. And the laws of logic are one of those, I would say, kind of highest order truths, right? Most universal, if I can use that term. In other words, meaning that it's inescapable. No person can function, can think, can reason, can hold opinions apart from the laws of logic. So at a minimum, we can say there are some truths, i.e. the logical truths, that apply to everyone. Now that we've established that foundation, can we begin to evaluate, using those logical laws, if there are other truths that also apply to everyone? That's how I might approach someone who's looking at a subjective or a relativistic perspective on truth. Good question. Any other questions? Hopefully you guys, well, I won't blame you if your heads are spinning a little bit. This was challenging to get through, so I applaud you for sitting through all of it. All right, well, oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so if I heard the question, what's the difference between inductive and abductive? Okay, so yeah, so that is a good question, and you're correct that abductive reasoning, which again is moving from evidence to the explanation, or the best explanation preferably, how does that differ from inductive reasoning? And they do seem to be similar because they are, right? They're both dealing with probabilistically true or most probable truth. But with the difference is that induction is dealing with a predictive nature. It has a predictive component, right? So if you think back to the illustration with the dictators, right? We were saying here's all of the evidence. Now we're going to predict the probability of the truth or the reliability of my conclusion, right? So with the dictators, all of these dictators have been evil men. Therefore, the next dictator I'm going to predict will also be an evil man. Induction, abductive reasoning doesn't have a predictive component. So it would look at something like the resurrection and say, okay, the tomb was empty. There were eyewitness testimonies. There were hostile testimonies or accounts that the tomb was empty. And you can go on down the list, and you could say, okay, what's the best explanation that accounts for all of those pieces of evidence together? Notice that there's no prediction happening there. We're just simply looking to explain the facts there. With induction, we're not seeking an explanation for why all dictators are evil men. That would be a different type of argument or a different formulation. Does that help clarify it a little bit? Yeah, good question. Wesley? I suppose you might be able to say it that way, but it's not really reasoning from general truths. Like, so with deduction, remember some of those examples that we were looking at. All Avengers live in the Marvel universe. Iron Man is a particular Avenger. Therefore, we can conclude with certain logical certainty that Iron Man is an Avenger. So we were going from all Avengers to a particular Avenger and then arguing from that. With abductive reasoning, we're not really arguing for a particular or arguing to a particular or utilizing that. We're simply saying, here's the evidence we have. Like, we often say, okay, what's the evidence for the empty tomb? And then we say, okay, and we lay it out. And then we say, therefore, here's the best explanation. And we might evaluate competing explanations, the hallucination, the swoon theory, the disciples stole the body theory, and so on. But right there, we're not really dealing with a particular. We could say, we could, I've got a couple batteries here, right? I could drop them on the floor. I could have you guys walk out of the room, drop them on the floor, right? Or you hear something hit the floor. They're no longer in my hand. They're no longer on the podium. They happen to be in various corners of the room, right? You wouldn't be arguing for any particular thing at that point or any general thing. You would simply be trying to explain the evidence. Now, the evidence could be that I threw them individually. It could be that I dropped them and then kicked them, right? There would be multiple competing explanations for why the batteries were no longer in my hand or up on the stage. So that's how I would differentiate between them. So it's not really arguing from general to particular because you're simply looking to explain relevant data. Any other questions? Sure. So how we can argue, or like any real world examples for deductive reasoning? So this, I'm going to speak out of my field and you guys will be able to correct me, right? You have the set of whole numbers, and then you have 2 is a whole number, right? So if every digit within the set of whole numbers, or how would I say this? This is what, so it's difficult, especially when you're working outside of your field, which number theory is definitely out of mine. But you would have every digit within the set of every even number is in the set of whole numbers, right? 2 is an even number, therefore 2 is in the set of whole numbers. So is that for you math and science people? Did I do that right? Okay, so there would be a real world example. The common one, right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now that's an interesting one because we can't go out and prove that all men are mortal. How would we do that? Well, you'd have to go kill everyone, right? No one's going to advocate for that. But there are certain truths that are assumed truths, for lack of a better term. They're assumed truths, or they're generally accepted, or sometimes referred to as self-evident truths. All men are mortal, everyone dies. Socrates is one of those particular mortals, and therefore we can say if both of those premises are true, then the conclusion is logically certain that Socrates will also die. Not as good a real-world example because it's kind of a hypothetical, although he did die, but it's not a provable premise. That first premise, it's not a provable one. Does that answer your question? Okay, yeah. If you look, the disciplines. So logic, when we're looking at modus tollens, modus ponens, or any of the other forms of deductive reasoning, you can start to play around with them and insert different ideas or different P's and Q's, right? and start to come up with real world examples. Mathematics deals heavily in deductive reasoning, as does geometry. So those are some real world disciplines where you actually utilize deductive reasoning. There are places where we can use it here, here meaning the real, in non-abstract or more academic fields. Philosophy uses a lot of deduction as well. The kalam is a deductive argument. So. Any other questions? Okay. Well, hopefully you guys' heads aren't spinning too much. I sure enjoyed going over this. Logic is fun to me because when I started studying, I realized like it works every time. If you do it right, if you have true premises, if you have true conclusions, then you end up with true, certainly true, or probabilistically true conclusions. And I like having that level of confidence in the things that I believe. And that's something, what I love is then that you can apply that level of confidence to the claims of Christianity quite well. So, all right, I think that's everything. Yeah, just as a reminder, if you guys are interested in more of what it would be, or what it would take to be an officer with Ratio Christi, go ahead and talk to us. Next week, we'll actually have some of the details we'll put up here on the screen, so you can start to evaluate whether that's something you would be willing to do yourself. So I guess that's it. Thanks, guys.